Welcome to our session on remaking higher education to address socioeconomic, ethnic, and gender inequality. My name is Jürgen Enders. I'm professor at the University of Bath and also a co-investigator of CGHE. I have the pleasure to chair this session with our 5 speakers: Hazelkorn, Aniko Horvath, Stephen Hunt, Diana Laurillard, and Michael Shattock. They have kindly agreed to briefly introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentations. After all the presentations, we will have some time for discussion and question and answers. Please write questions and comments into the chat function during the presentations. I can then later, after the presentations, call upon you and ask you to unmute yourself and share your question. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to Michael Shattock for our first presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jürgen. It's very nice to be here. I've been asked to say something about myself, but all I'm going to say is that I lead the governance group in CGHE, in the Centre for Global Higher Education, and my colleagues, Aniko Horvath, Jürgen himself, our chairman, and Hazelkorn, who will be speaking later, are the other members of the group. Our plan for the presentation is that I will make the presentation and Aniko Horvath will answer all the questions. She thinks that I'm going to burst in and try and take some of the answers, but I'm not. I'm going to leave it entirely to her. Our presentation is based on 3 diagrams, which will give a simplified view, an account of some of our research findings. And our research is a continuation of the CGHE research on higher education governance, the first product of which was our book on the governance of British higher education. But that's only the first stage in the writing up of our overall research on the governance of European higher education. What we've done is we've selected a number of European countries: Germany, Hungary, Norway, Portugal, and the UK, for extensive interviewing. We think we've clocked up something like nearly 200 face-to-face interviews. And the countries were selected because we thought they would provide a representative picture of European higher education. Now, let us move to the first figure. Now, I'm really not going to dwell on this. This was the famous Clark triangle, and it's only there as a model for what's going to come in the second and third figures. But what you should remember is that when Bob Clark talked about it, he would put the US in the right-hand corner of the market. He would put Germany in the left-hand corner, academic oligarchy. He would put the UK somewhere half up the line between academic oligarchy and the state, and directly under the state, he would put France and Italy. Next figure. What we've seen since Clark's model, and after all, Clark's triangle was first presented in 1993 in his book, The Higher Education System, a lot of water has flown under the governance bridges across Europe. And what we've seen, and this is using the EU phraseology, what we've seen, or it's alleged that we've seen, is a modernization of higher education. And we thought, therefore, that we ought to modernize the Clark Triangle. This is the modernization that we've adopted, and let me point to you the main changes. Remember that the Clark Triangle was first produced some nearly 30 years ago. So the first change is how we presented the state. The state in Clark's triangle was one corner of the triangle. Here, it envelops the whole of higher education. So what we're showing, and particularly in continental Europe, what we're showing is a situation where it's alleged that autonomy is devolved from the state to institutions, and the state management is replaced by state steering. But what we've put into inside the circle is the triangle containing the components, the three key components of institutional governance. And there what you see is executive management at the top, the rectors, the vice chancellors and their senior management teams. In the right-hand corner, you see the academic community, and in many universities, you would call that the faculty, because the faculty controls academic life. And the left-hand side, what you see is a new entry, which is lay governance, which relates to lay-dominated governing bodies, and also to the concept that society itself should share in the governance of higher education. Figure 3.
Mike, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much. Here what you see is the working through of the triangle, which reflects most closely our research. If you were looking at the triangle, you would say that the ideal balance of governance is somewhere a point which is equidistant between executive management, lay governance, and the faculty. And there we have cited, for the moment at least, Germany and Norway. If you turn to the right, what you see is Portugal. Now, Portugal does not have the characteristic that Germany and Norway have, which is strong executive management, strong faculty, and strong lay governance. What it only has is strong executive management and strong faculty. It is weak on lay governance. But there are two outriders in this approach. One is the UK, and you'll see that the UK, which under Bob Clark's formulation of 30 years ago, was closely linked between the state and the academic community. Now what you see is that in the UK, the linkage is between executive management and lay governance. And we have put no linkage with the academic community. And our last example is Hungary. And here, if you look at Hungary, you see, first of all, a dominant state. You have the situation where non-academic managers have been put into universities by the state with the power of veto over rectors. You've had universities being privatized only recently. You have, on the whole, subservient executive management who take orders direct from the state. And the ultimate is that the executive management translates the state's requirements to the faculty. So our conclusion is that modernization is tending to move in the wrong direction. The ideal of state steering and institutional self-governance is not being realized in any country. National governments are reasserting themselves, and the freedoms envisaged a decade ago are in danger of being reversed. Increasingly, governments are trying to subordinate universities to state structures rather than encouraging greater autonomy and freedom of maneuver. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very interesting. Let me just remind the audience, please, yes, start asking questions, making comments in the chat function, so that later on I can call upon you. But now we move on to the short presentation by Stephen Hunt. Stephen?
Right, yeah, sorry, I'm just going to set up my slideshow. So that should be visible as a slideshow to everyone. Yes, I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Stephen Hunt. I've been working at the Centre for Global Higher Education for 5 years, and I've basically been concentrating on UK higher education and particularly alternative forms of higher education, such as private providers, and more recently, other non-university higher education, such as FE colleges. And in fact, Mike and I gave a presentation for the Centre for Global Higher Education last Thursday, in which we looked at their data concerning FE colleges. And you can see that if you go on the CGHE YouTube website. But this time, I'm going to be talking about private providers in the UK and their relationship to addressing inequalities. The right to enrol students with publicly backed tuition fee loans on what are termed designated courses has been extended to about 115 private or alternative higher education institutions in the UK. Of these, only 5 have the title university and 4 the related and equally legally protected title university college. Amongst these 115 institutions, there is evidence that widening participation in higher education has been realised. The composition of the student body at private providers is distinct from the public sector in several respects. They tend to be older, and we can see here the age distribution in public providers of higher education on the left, and on the right at alternative or private providers, as I'm calling them during this presentation. And on the left, we could see that about 80% are 24 years old or younger, and on the right, about 50% are 25 years old or older, and about 40% are 30 years or older. So in that respect, you can see they're introducing older students to higher education in greater numbers in the private sector. The students at private providers are also more likely to be from ethnic minorities. Again, we can see the sort of distribution on the left. The public providers, where 70% are identified as white, and over 50% alternative or private providers are identified as coming from ethnic minorities. So again, a distinctly different makeup of the student body. Interestingly, women are the majority of students in both sectors, although there is a greater proportion of male students in the private sector. So even in that respect, you could see that widening participation is being realised in the private sector. This is the intake. But during their education, students in private providers are more likely to drop out. Half of the 10 providers with the highest dropout rates for first degrees were private providers. It's often contended that private providers face greater dropout rates because of the greater prevalence of non-traditional students. Yet, despite the dropout rates, along with widening participation, the data concerning leavers' destinations is also encouraging. For those graduating, there's little distinguish the rates at which the graduates from either sector are in work or further study, and we can see that in the, again, and the left-hand side is public and the right-hand side is private, and we can see in the extreme left columns of both total in work or further study, 91 and 87%. So little to distinguish them in those respects. However, a critical measure now used for officially assessing an institution's educational provision and ultimately eligibility to run designated courses is the type of employment, with a distinction being made in the case of graduates being between professional and non-professional employment. Drilling down the data on leavers' destinations indicates that fewer students from private providers are employed at professional level occupations. It doesn't seem to be an issue with postgraduates, which has been an area of concentration for the private sector for a long time. But we can see with respect to first degrees that there's a 10 percentage point difference between those attaining professional employment. And it's even more extreme when we see other undergraduates that will be pursuing courses that perhaps not at degree level. And we can look at the converse relation, that is the percentages in non-professional occupations by subject. And here, if we see the second column, business studies, this is a sort of prime focus of provision in the private sector, and we can see from that, and that we could, the numbers are on top of that, but the percentages indicated that 60% pursuing business studies, one of the concentrations of the private providers, is 60% are failing to attain non-professional occupations. The percentage is much lower in creative arts, which has a long history of presence in the alternative or the private sector. So, and there people, the graduates do a lot better. So to conclude, while private providers may affect widening participation, they find it more difficult to retain students and for their graduates to access what are expected to be graduate level employment. Consequently, accessing higher education itself may not eradicate the inequality, but simply relocate it within the graduate body. And with that, I've concluded my presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much. You make life for the chair of the session easy. We move on now to Diana Laurillard. Yeah, there she is.
Yes, I'm here and I think I'm unmuted. I'm just going to start the presentation. And you should now be seeing my slides. So my name is Diana Laurillard. I'm a professor of learning with digital technology. I work in the UCL Knowledge Lab, along with my colleague Eileen Kennedy, both of us also working on our CGHE project on the transformational potential of MOOCs. So to speak to our conference theme, our input here is to argue that if higher education is to achieve its potential for making the world a better place, we need to overcome the unequal way in which our impact falls on societies. Now, the mission statements of universities, as I emphasized this morning, are certainly ambitious, and those I've already quoted from Oxford and from UCL. And this kind of mission, of course, is common to many universities across the country and in other countries as well, where the goal is to have a beneficial impact on society in some way or other. Now, higher education, as we know, does have a critical impact on the world, and the pandemic has shown that. But it's also shown us how the already huge inequalities in our societies have been greatly increased in the face of this disaster. So this is the point where I ended my input to the opening session this morning, to propose that we could use massive open online collaborations as a way for higher education to help in overcoming inequalities. So here we're going to show how this can work in practice and what kind of input it can have. Our project on the transformational potential of MOOCs is experimenting with ways of using these large-scale courses to help with reducing the inequalities that we find primarily in teacher professional development. So to support teachers effectively, we work with those in the most challenging circumstances, especially those working with refugee children in Lebanon, for example. Our question is, could MOOCs provide them, those teachers, with the kind of support and guidance they need for their most challenging educational circumstances? And our methodology begins with this explicit model of a theory of change, from engaging with local providers and stakeholders right at the start, through to ending up in a position where we can sustain those courses through the local stakeholders themselves. In April 2020, we launched a MOOC on teaching online in Arabic, which has attracted over 46,000 enrollments, so we can demonstrate the scale, across the MENA region. And many of these teachers once rejected online learning, and they've now discovered its value and the part it can play alongside conventional methods. Well, as part of our theory of change approach, the videos we use in the courses are always sourced from teachers who already had experience of new pedagogies or of using digital technologies. And this is to help participants see what's possible. And you can see that our MOOCs are different from typical courses. They're massive open online collaborations between universities and professionals in the community. And in each of these MOOCs of this kind, we've included surveys to establish the impact of the course on the participants, the teachers, and on the ultimate beneficiaries, their students, like using the toolkit and promoting it to all the educators I meet, becoming more aware of aspects of planning and supporting the class, changed my view of modern technology and its importance. I used to think that online education would be useless with my students. And we also asked, to what extent do you think your students have benefited from the knowledge or skills you acquired in the course? Their evaluations were very good, they were ready for the next tasks, they had more confident teacher, and they enjoyed what they were doing. These are the kinds of things that we get back from these teachers. Then we did something similar on the FutureLearn platform in English in January 2021. This was for the Blended and Online Learning Design course, and it was for teachers in all subjects and all sectors of education. Of course, these things reach across the globe. And these are some of our course reviews where we highlight the phrases that show they are willing to share their ideas and collaborate on new forms of teaching. I enjoyed it, reviewing teachers' designs, even if they were very different to the subjects I teach. Browsing other teachers' learning designs lets me learn from their pedagogy far more easily than from resources. I learned greatly from each session, from peer comments and feedbacks. So teachers, unlike many other professionals, I suspect, they love hearing about what other professionals have done and learning from them. Now in CGHE, we're exploring what this could mean for the future development of our knowledge and understanding about online learning. And this is how we build knowledge in the context of academic science and scholarship. We begin by browsing journals and adopting others' ideas, then adapt them and create something new, which we test, redesign and retest until we're at the point where we're ready to have it reviewed by others and finally publish for others to use. And that's how we build scientific and scholarly knowledge. But we never do that in education. And now we really need to be doing that, to be building community knowledge for professional development, where in our case, the exchange is not via journal papers, but peer-reviewed learning designs, new ways of teaching and learning. So in week 2 of one of our TPD courses here, teachers are asked to use a generic learning design derived from a physics example about the water cycle and adapt the pedagogy to their own topic. They share the link to their design, and they do that on this Padlet wall. Oops, sorry, too fast. And you can see from here, there's quite a range of topic areas sourced from the same original design, where the teachers have adapted that original idea from a physics teacher and found that as a useful starting point for formulating their own ideas. Things like explaining how to write effective conclusions in academic essays, digital mixing desks, planet conservation area plan, child development, vaccination rebellion, an enormously wide range of topics. And that's because we share the pedagogy, and most of what they write in the learning design is pedagogic instructions to the students. And the topic points can then be exchanged for almost any topic. I mean, they adapt them a lot. There are a lot of differences here, but you've got a starting point and you've got a shared starting point. Then by the third week, we're inviting them to carry out a peer review process on each other's designs according to a shared rubric, and then submit their revised design for consideration for a collection of published designs for the website. And this is how we try to emulate the world of scientific knowledge. This is a bold future we can now envisage with all these kinds of designs being shared on the website with other people from a range of different kinds of topic areas and from all different sectors of higher education, vocational education. This one down here is Year 4, primary education. Now, this model for teacher professional development now needs to be tested beyond the teaching profession. And given the point I made about the importance of professional development for the UN SDGs, and our first MOOC for a different area, Eileen Kennedy is tackling an aspect of the climate crisis by running a MOOC on sustainable energy access for communities. It just started a week ago, and it's attracted participants from this wide range of countries, including low and middle income countries, and an extraordinary range of personal professional experience. So now we have to test the potential of this type of collaborative model for this very diverse combination of professionals. Can we enable them to share their experience and collaborate on where to find solutions? So as a way to overcome the unequal way in which our impact falls on humanity across the globe, this approach is promising so far, certainly worth testing. So to summarize, we've been able to show that large scale is feasible. Professionals can be very engaged. Many are willing to collaborate. Some have shared outputs publicly, being open to all countries and free. It's genuinely inclusive. And it reaches also into the LMICs, who are the 40% of active learners. So we're therefore proposing this model as one way that HE can perhaps help to reduce social and economic inequalities across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you. We now moving on to the last presentation. Please continue to raise questions in the chat. We already have some. And now I hand over to Ellen Hazelkorn. You have to unmute yourself, Ellen.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm Ellen Hazelkorn. I'm an emeritus professor of the Technological University in Dublin and also a member of the CGHE Research Management Committee and Board. So I was asked to kind of present a critical perspective on some of the issues. So that's I come in with some bit more critical and provocative comments on what people have presented. So I want to say the following: despite years of increasing and widening participation strategies, there's evidence of widening inequality gaps and growing divergences in opportunities and outcomes across many countries. In fact, in every country where data is available, participation in higher education continues to be more unequal from a social background perspective. Disadvantaged students remain underrepresented amongst those entering the system, and if they enroll, they are overrepresented in less prestigious institutions and/or degree programs. Due to deeply embedded social cultural advantages held by more affluent groups in societies, opportunities for upward mobility vary so considerably that it's no longer certain that a higher education qualification is sufficient for personal success and social equity. Being left behind is not just a perception or a slogan. Indeed, evidence shows that social mobility in many advanced countries, the UK particularly, has been stalled for decades. Income inequality affects trust, looking at trust monitors, and giving way to levels of personal and societal grievance and unrest that we see around the world today. Educational attainment is a key differentiator. Indeed, the COVID crisis, rather than being the great leveler that many people shouted about, has in fact exaggerated many of these inequalities. So in turning to the theme, what have we learned about addressing socioeconomic, ethnic, and gender inequality? Well, we know that massification isn't sufficient. And more students isn't sufficient. In addition, equity policies tend to prioritize elite participation or elite university participation, and they fail to support financially or otherwise alternative routes or learner or career pathways across the tertiary system. We know that strategies of picking winners or concentrating resources has led to greater inequity and regional disparities. And individual initiatives are too often dependent on soft money and transient commitments. As Salmi and Diageo point out, the most effective equity promotion policies are those that combine financial aid with measures to overcome non-financial obstacles. The national commitment translating into comprehensive, well-resourced policies is indispensable to designing and implementing effective equity policies which embrace what I would say is the whole educational pipeline from cradle to grave. But let's not excuse the universities here. They're not innocent victims. They're still seen as arenas of privilege. They provide a gateway to opportunity for some, but many oftentimes act as gatekeepers. They promote concepts of meritocracy and success, which exclude far too many students and track too few student milestones. And as they pursue prestige at home and abroad, many have sought to monetize their rank by widening the gap between cost and price. So it's time to think about a new model of educational provision for high participation societies. Digitalization is one type, as Diana has illustrated, but massive inductions into system capacity are required with additional support for learners. Otherwise, we will simply foster more inequalities. And Roberta referred to this in her talk this morning or earlier. As we rethink programs and institutional practices, it's clear also that greater commitment to flexibility and responsiveness is required. New learner landscape, to which Steve refers, challenges the existing model, which envisages students progressing systematically from primary to secondary to tertiary, and then into lifetime employment. Indeed, the funding model needs to reflect these changed circumstances and objectives. Again, the UK has done some, or mainly England has done some thinking, and I think taking a cue from Biden, or indeed it was previously Obama, and the community college, or whatever its equivalent is, should actually be free to encourage greater and wider participation. Clark's triangle, which Mike and Aniko discussed, will likely undergo further modernization, to use that term. But stronger and more effective governance at system and institutional level will continue to evolve, holding both the academy and its leadership to account. The question is, which governance models might work best in this regard to ensure that institutions are held to account with regard to social and national priorities. And as Calhoun noted in 2006, the public purpose of universities has been given too little active attention. Brexit revealed the dangers of universities being isolated as islands of remain and seas of leave. Other countries have their own versions of this scenario. So this is where all of us come into it, and the role of CG and others out there who are listening. This is where research comes in. There's a strong need to better understand where the disparities characterizing tertiary education come from, and which policies and institutional actions are more effective and sustainable, and at which level in reducing inequality in all its forms. across the educational ladder. To create the key, it seems to me, is that in addressing socioeconomic, ethnic, and gender inequality, which we're asked to do in terms of remaking higher education, must be based on a truly diverse and seamless post-secondary system with fundamental principles of shared governance, collaboration, engagement, and networking across educational institutions, enterprise, local authorities, civic society, as well as between further and higher education and schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And thank you very much to all the other speakers. So we have some questions already, but please continue to write others into the chat. As you know, we will move after this session also into a breakout room where we can continue discussion. I have to start with, we go back to the presentation by Mike, but the answers by Aniko. I have two questions for Aniko, one from Alison Wheaton and one from Rachel Brooks. I would like to start with Alison, who I can see now already. Yes, please, Alison.
Thank you, Jürgen. My question is really whether Aniko could elaborate. Mike mentioned the role of wider society in university governance across the different countries. And I wondered if Aniko could elaborate on that, and also in particular whether that involvement relates in any way to today's conversation about inequalities.
Should I just go ahead and answer?
Oh, yes, please,
policy. Yeah. All right. So, well, you see a great variety across the different countries, and one of the striking features, and in that sense, it's good that we have Hungary included, is that sometimes the rules and regulations that make possible society involvement, lay involvement in universities are very similar in many ways, and they still are used and deployed in very different manners. So the same kind of approaches that you would find roughly in Germany or in Norway are very differently used and applied in Hungary. So that's one of the really important and striking differences when you look at lay involvement. So in Hungary, events happen so quickly that it's hard to follow still. Some of the most recent developments are that they are completely moving public higher education into a foundation model, and they created new advisory boards, and they take completely over. For example, they are lay people, so come from society, many of them with political background, still active political background, and the way society interests are set to be imposed are basically just a smokescreen for quite often imposing private interest. On the other hand, what you see, for example, in other models in Norway, it's very clearly an approach where you want to bring in different kind of views from society. And it's very interesting that in the interviews we've done with these members, lay members of the universities we visited, quite often they become in many ways native in the sense that they become more representative sometimes of the ideal typical higher education models than you would have from the members of the academic community, for example, or from students. So in that sense, they represent both society and interest. In the UK, again, you have very different approaches. You could see, and we wrote about that in the book we published. Based on the different countries and the traditions and histories. So the lay involvement has a different kind of understanding, for example, in Wales or in Scotland than you would find in England. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but at least tries to address some.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Rachel Brooks.
Thank you. Yes, Aniko, just to sort of develop what you started to say, I think, in the answer to the previous question, what are the implications of these different governance structures for promoting equality and inclusion amongst the student populations in the various countries?
what we see in all of the countries that actually formally students are represented quite strongly in one way or another in university governance. So there are different rules and regulations of how much voice they have or how much power they have, but we've seen it in all countries, that they are there on the boards, sometimes in the university executive they have direct access and they have a strong voice. However, if you think about how they can actually achieve something, I think that what we find that the rules and regulations that are beyond what they can do on a governing body are much stronger. So, for example, in Norway, the fact that they have a system where student bodies, they have a parallel system, student parliaments that are within the university, but they also have a system where they have a body that regulates all the access for students. So meaning housing, care facilities, for example, for their children, and so on and so on. And these kind of things are put in place basically by law. And they have funding, which is really significant funding, and that makes actually equality and access attainable in different ways that you would see in other countries. So just being represented on a university's governing body or having a national student organization, it's not necessarily enough to basically have that kind of equality that we are talking about in this panel. What you see that you have to have some kind of other protections. And for example, if you look at the UK, that's one of the interesting things that we find, that the way funding is allocated, for example, to student unions and student bodies is crucial in the way they can actually raise their voice. So in the UK, because their funding comes from the university directly and it's not regulated clearly, that they always have the same amount or an increased amount of funding, it's always a kind of anxiety and fear in the student unions that when and what kind of concerns they can raise in order not to undermine the positions of the next generations of student representatives. And you don't have that kind of impact, for example, in Norway or not even in Hungary. I'm not sure if that answers what you are asking, but.
Thank you, that's great, thank you.
Thank you both. The next question, I think, is best put forward to Diana. It was about online education, online teaching and learning. Gerald Arif.
Hi, Jürgen, thank you. Yes, just want to ask, perhaps from Diana's perspective, referring to Clark's triangle model that was mentioned in the first session, what is your view, whether you mentioned about MOOCs, which are free, but in countries like Indonesia, we still need a formal degree, which is recognized by the government. So do you see whether online degree delivery is still feasible to be implemented to increase inclusion for the masses? Thank you.
Well, no, I'm afraid not, unfortunately. I mean, you'll notice that we talked all the time about MOOCs for professional development. MOOCs are massive, and so they don't offer the kind of one-to-one nurturing that a student needs. And so I wouldn't even use them for teaching at master's level. There's too much one-to-one that a student at those sorts of levels needs. So you can't use it for that, but you can use them for getting to the people who teach those people. And so within the context of Indonesia, for example, you clearly have a massive industry of private universities and many higher education teachers in the public universities as well. But all of those people need updating in ways in which they can teach in different ways using digital technologies. Now, it's feasible to get to tens of thousands of teachers through a MOOC who can then get to, each one gets to, I don't know, 100 students or something, and you're building the numbers up. You've got this multiplier effect, which enables you to reach millions of students indirectly. So as long as you think of the MOOCs as either or both, educating the professionals who can educate other professionals or their workers or employees or whomever, or you see them as mini courses which can be part of what you give to your own students. So the one that I mentioned that Eileen is developing, for example, on sustainable energy access for communities, about climate change and the ways in which we do renewable energy and so on. That course could be embedded in an undergraduate course or a secondary school course about these kinds of issues, because it's managed by the teacher, and the teacher interprets it and helps the students understand it and so on. So it's those kinds of things that we're thinking in terms of, not of radically changing the way higher education done for undergraduates through MOOCs. They're a supplement, perhaps, but that's all we can say in terms of education. But professionals, they're perfectly designed. Professionals don't need that. They need lots of other professionals helping them with ideas. But that, I think, could be a key to enabling us to think on the large scale for these very large scale challenges that we have. And your numbers are very big numbers.
Thank you very much, Diana. We have time for a short question and a short answer before we move on. There is something from Vincent Carpentier, and I'm not quite sure who best to ask, but maybe you can ask Stephen. Vincent?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Many thanks for the presentation. So very short question, basically, about this idea, and that could be for Steve or Helen. I mean, you know, it's about this question of whether differentiation, you know, could avoid leading to stratification. So my question is whether you know about systems, or you know, what are the kind of conditions or barriers to make sure that actually a system leads in a way to transfer and to student mobility within institutions themselves, but also within sectors. So you mentioned the tertiary education. In relation to Stephen, that can be as well the link between the private and public. But it's about this question of whether differentiation can avoid stratification, so mobility of students.
Maybe if I might jump in. Vincent, yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I'd say one thing on with regard to system governance. I think one of the problems is we tend to look at system governance largely in terms of public sector only. I think we need to look at the system governance in terms of public-private within a common framework, a set of things that's common in many countries where we basically only have the public. We need to look at a much more flexible system that allows credit transfer and so on. But it's not just a one-way ticket. A lot of the entries into what might be further or colleges or further education, TVET and so on, they tend to be stratified. England's now looking at introducing or reintroducing a tracking at an earlier age. Bad idea. But aside from that, it's the idea of increasing mobility and flexibility over time and over age. Not something that starts. I mean, I noticed, I mean, even looking at Steve's data was really quite interesting in looking at that kind of age profile. But as we look at the changing demographics that are taking place, that whole approach and looking at it much more cohesively. I'd go back to some of the stuff that Roberta was talking about.
Thank you.
Stephen, would you like to say something briefly?
Yeah, it might be a case of, it'd be very difficult to change, but as we heard from Chris Millwood, about employers' attitudes. So if it might be easier for a new provider or one that's specializing in something to demonstrate it had high quality teaching, and if that could be taken seriously by employers, then you might not have, as it were, just relying on a prejudice of employing people from highly prestigious institutions and looking at the actual skills that they might have acquired from the course. I don't see that would be impossible, but changing those attitudes would be, you know, I think it might be easy to show there's evidence of good teaching, but it might be much more difficult to get employers to take it seriously. But that would be one way of addressing inequalities once people have graduated.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Many thanks to very interesting and inspiring presenters. Many thanks for a very lively and interesting discussion. As you know, you can now choose to move on to the next session in the program of the conference, or to continue this discussion with us in a breakout group. The links to both sessions you will find not only in the program, but also in the chat function of this session. So hope to meet quite some of you in a few moments in our breakout room. If so, see you there. Bye-bye for now.